The moon hung low and heavy over the Vosges Mountains on the night of September 15, 1944, casting a pale, deceptive light over the farmland of Alsace-Lorraine. For 4 men of the 2nd Special Air Service, that light was a betrayal. They tumbled out of a storm-tossed sky, their transport aircraft blown miles off course, their parachutes catching the wind like ghostly sails. They were supposed to land in quiet isolation, hidden by darkness. Instead, they drifted down onto the exposed fields of occupied France with no cover, no functioning radios, and the terrifying knowledge that every shadow could hide a watching eye. This was Operation Pistol. Their mission, to sever the German lifeline, the railways and communications arteries pumping supplies to the front lines. 4 Squadron Quartermaster Sergeant John Alcock, a butcher's boy from Goul who had already survived the hell of Dunkirk in 1940, this was a familiar kind of chaos. He led a small team, Corporal Holden, Corporal Hanna, and Private Licksack. They had minimal supplies, no transport, and the entire German 7th Army between them and safety. In the following days, the local French farmers, ordinary people with extraordinary courage, took them in. Hidden in barns and fed in secret, the SAS men melted into the landscape. On a stretch of track near the village of Innsming, they planted their explosives. When the train passed, the blast tore through the night, derailing German supplies and killing 2 officers. It was a clean strike, a perfect hit. But perfection has a price. The explosion lit a fuse that would burn straight back to them. The Gestapo, relentless and efficient, began to hunt. And soon, a pair of Polish workmen, for reasons lost to history, decided to talk. The noose tightened on September 24, not with the sound of gunfire, but with the silence of a missing radio. Alcock's men had realized their set was gone, stolen from the drop zone, they would later learn, by a 15-year-old French boy who had no idea the small device would doom the soldiers to isolation. Without it, there would be no supplies, no reinforcements, no extraction plan. They were ghosts now, truly alone. But the real trap snapped shut 3 days later, at a farmstead near the village of Koking. Alcock and his men had sought refuge, the family taking them in with that quiet, desperate bravery that defined the French resistance. Inside a modest cottage, 2 young women served them food as rain lashed against the windows. Then, the knock came. It was a German patrol. Alcock pressed himself against the wall, pistol in hand, his heart a drum against his ribs. Through a crack in the door, he could see the helmets, the rifles. The soldiers began questioning the girls. One of them, young and terrified, could barely speak. According to Alcock's own account, told years later to his son, the moment hung on a thread. If the girl broke, if the Germans decided to search, he would have to shoot. At close range it would be a bloodbath, and they would not walk away. But the Germans, perhaps satisfied by the girl's denials, turned and left. Alcock exhaled. They had survived by inches. Yet the hunt was now real, and every farmhouse that offered shelter could just as easily become their grave. The roads were crawling with patrols, and ahead of them lay a forest crawling with SS. They had to move, but with a sickening twist, Corporal Holden began to shake, not from fear, but from the bone-rattling fever of malaria. They were deep in enemy territory, one man unable to walk, and no way out. The forest of Duz swallowed them whole. For 3 days, the 4 men pushed deeper into the wet, choking darkness, with Corporal Holden slung between them, his body racked with fever, his teeth chattering loud enough to wake the dead. They had no food. They drank from puddles. And all around them, the SS patrols moved like wolves, their dogs barking in the distance, their voices echoing through the trees. Alcock, the butcher's boy turned leader, made a decision that would define them. They would not surrender. They would not be taken to the camps. They would fight, or they would die trying to reach the American lines, still 60 miles to the west. But first, they needed to move Holden. And to move him, they needed a miracle. On the 3rd night, they found it. A woodcutter's hut, isolated, reeking of smoke and damp. Inside, an old Frenchman sat by a fire, his face weathered by decades of labor. He looked at the 4 ragged men, at Holden's shaking frame, and said nothing. He simply moved aside and pointed to a pile of straw in the corner. For 2 days they hid there, the old man bringing them bread and water, never asking their names, never speaking of the war. When the SS came to search the forest, they passed within 50 yards of the hut. The old man sat by his fire, whittling a stick, and never looked up. But the fever would not break. Holden grew weaker, his eyes hollow, his breath shallow. Alcock knew the mathematics of survival. If they stayed, they would all die. If they moved, they might die faster. He gathered the others. "We carry him," he said, "or we don't go." So they carried him. Through the nights, through the marshes, through the endless, watching trees. They crossed roads on their bellies, froze in ditches as convoys passed, and once when a German motorcycle patrol stopped 20 yards from their hiding place, they buried their faces in the mud and prayed to gods they weren't sure they believed in. The soldiers lit cigarettes, laughed about something, and drove on. On the 12th night, they stumbled out of the forest and into a clearing that smelled of diesel and danger. Before them lay a German airfield, lit up like a Christmas tree, the silhouettes of Messerschmitt fighters parked in neat rows. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their flashlights cutting through the dark.
Alcock froze.
They had walked straight into the belly of the beast. To go back meant certain capture. To go forward meant crossing that airfield, crawling past armed sentries, with a dying man in their arms.
Alcock made the call.
They would go through. For 3 hours, they moved like shadows. On their bellies, inch by inch, they crossed the open ground, the growl of aircraft engines covering the sound of their breathing. Once, a guard stopped 10 feet from where Corporal Hanna lay pressed into the grass, his face buried in the dirt, his hand clamped over his own mouth to stop the scream building in his chest. The guard lit a cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating the grass inches from Hanna's boot.
Then he walked on.
By dawn, they were through. But Holden was slipping away. His skin was gray now, his eyes open but unseeing. They found a barn, laid him in the hay, and watched him fade. Alcock sat with him through the long daylight hours, holding his hand, whispering words that Holden could no longer hear.
By nightfall, he was gone.
They buried him in an unmarked grave, in a field they would never find again.
No chaplain, no flag.
Just 3 men, standing in the rain, saying goodbye to a friend they couldn't save. Then they turned west, and walked on. The rain stopped on the morning of October 18, 1944. Alcock, Hanna, and Licksack emerged from a final stretch of woodland to find themselves staring at a miracle. Below them, in a shallow valley, a column of American Sherman tanks sat idling, their white stars gleaming in the weak autumn sun.
GIs lounged on the hulls, smoking, laughing, alive.
For a long moment, the 3 men just stood there, unable to move. They had walked for 33 days. They had crossed 200 miles of enemy territory. They had buried a friend, outrun Gestapo dogs, and crawled past SS patrols in the dark.
And now, here was the end.
Not with a bang, but with the mundane, beautiful sight of American soldiers brewing coffee. Licksack, the Polish paratrooper who had already lost his homeland once, sank to his knees.
Hanna, the quiet one, simply wept.
And Alcock, the butcher's boy who had carried them all, lit a cigarette with hands that would not stop shaking. When they finally walked down that hill, the Americans nearly shot them. 3 ragged, bearded men emerging from German territory in mismatched uniforms looked exactly like a trap. But someone spotted the Union Jack sewn onto Alcock's sleeve, and the rifles lowered. A young lieutenant approached, his face a mixture of disbelief and awe. "Where the hell did you come from?" Alcock took a long drag on his cigarette and smiled, the first genuine smile in over a month.
"Other side of the woods, Mate."
They were debriefed, fed, and given clean clothes. The story of their escape spread through the American lines like wildfire. Men who had never heard of the SAS, who barely knew where Britain was, shook their hands and called them heroes. But Alcock would never see it that way. Heroes, he would later tell his son, were the ones who didn't come back.
Men like Holden, buried in a nameless French field.
Men like the old woodcutter who risked everything for strangers. Men like the girls in that farmhouse who lied to the Gestapo with steady voices and terrified hearts. In December 1944, Alcock was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his leadership. Hanna and Licksack received the military medal. But the real reward came on a quiet night in 1946, when Alcock sat in his kitchen in Goul, reading a letter from the French government. They wanted to thank him, thank all of them, for what they had done. He folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and never spoke of the war again. But sometimes, on autumn evenings, when the rain fell soft against the window, he would walk to the end of his garden and just stand there, looking east.
Not at anything, just looking, remembering a forest, a fever, a friend who didn't make it home.
And somewhere in the Vosges, in a field that has long since returned to farmland, a young man named Holden lies in a grave that was never marked, never visited, never named.
But not forgotten.
Not by the 3 who walked out. And not by history, for in the end, this was not a story of escape. It was a story of men who refused to leave each other behind. And in that refusal, they found a way out of hell.